works.
Yeah.
It's 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 postmodernism, um, given a practical object. That that's what I think the red brown movement is nowadays with Hinkle and Haas and Caleb Maupin. It's like they've internalized postmodernism and then they've decided on an actual label, which usually means it's opposite, right? And they'll call that dialectical. Watch, it's coming. Hang on just a second. Got to get my coffee.
External, yeah, external dialectism, right.
Used to be Caleb is channeling Lyndon LaRouche.
Yeah.
And LaRouche, I think, talked about dialectics too, as I recall. So,
Right. What was that? The red brown bowel movement?
Yeah, exactly. The
That,
uh
yeah, can't think. The just
Caleb
the
is,
external dialectic. Oh, you just put two things together and you can show how they interact, by forcing them next to each other, right?
yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Ugh. Wait. So you were
You
going to
know
start
what's interesting?
690. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
As I was about to say, you're about to start 695, right?
Yeah, I was, and then I realized I need my coffee, and right now I'm waiting for my coffee to finish. So
Ah,
now I guess I'm gonna read. So here we go. Okay, so the mediating element has now determined itself one as simple determinate universality, like the particularity in the syllogism of existence. But two, as objective universality, that is to say, universality which contains the entire determinateness of the distinguished extremes, like the allness of the syllogism of reflection, a fulfilled yet simple universality, the universal nature of the fact, the genus. Okay, and this is the middle term, right? Right? Am I right? He said middle term.
right.
Yeah,
What?
the mediating element, right?
Right.
This syllogism is pregnant with content because the abstract middle term of the syllogism of existence posits. Hang on.
I mean, it does kind of. What is it? It's
Uh,
just trying to think how it mirrors at this point. Started the is.
I know. I'm just
Yeah.
making sure that I have this right. Okay. So
Okay.
A is
Right.
syllogism of existence. All right. Because the abstract middle term of the syllogism of existence posited itself as determinate difference to become the middle term of the syllogism of reflection, while this difference has reflected itself into simple identity again. This syllogism is therefore the syllogism of necessity, for its middle term is not some alien immediate content, but the reflection into self of the determinateness of the extremes. Interesting.
Right. Because it's
So,
this.
so, so both extremes and their determinateness are moments, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
of the mediating term, right?
Yeah. And the start, like it's mirrored the first form of the syllogism.
Yeah,
It's just is kind of like formally, we're right here. Right. And then in reflection, they're just externally related to each other through the particular. Now the particular actually contains.
yeah. So these possess in the middle term their inner identity, the determinations of whose content are the form determinations of the extremes. Consequently, that which differentiates the terms appears as an external and unessential form, and the terms themselves as moments of a necessary existence. In the first instance, this syllogism is immediate and thus formal insofar as the connection of the terms is the essential nature as content. And this content is present in the distinguished terms in only a diverse form, and the extremes by themselves are merely an unessential subsistence. The realization of this syllogism has so to determine it that the extremes also shall be posited as this totality which initially the middle term is, and that the necessity of the relation, which is at first only the substantial content, shall be a relation of the posited form. Okay. And so then we have the categorical, the hypothetical, and the disjunctive syllogism. Hang on just a second.
How many slices of meat you mentioned?
One.
One. Okay. Oh, wait there.
Ooh. Political solution. Let's see a B.
Oh, oh. What's going on?
The being of A is taken as the middle term of the syllogism.
Okay. So the
Okay. That's how B. Okay.
so the categorical uh I really wish he gave like real um examples of how this plays out in real reasoning. Because I realize it's a handbook for using the syllogism in the various ways, but
Well, I
unless you
think
already
this,
have individual, particular, and universal, um, I don't know, juxtapositions in mind, it's hard to imagine an example off the top of your head without experience.
yeah, let me see if I can. Because remember that poster I have actually has examples.
Oh yeah,
I'm going to see if I have a clear picture right now.
okay.
If not, I'll try to get I'll have to light mine up. But oh, okay, I did. So for this one, we have Charles is a human. Is human. Humans are thinking animals. Ergo, Charles thinks.
Okay. For the categorical.
Yeah.
And what's the middle term?
Human.
Okay, so human is the middle term. Middle term is the essential nature of the individual and not just any of its determinateness or properties, and as similarly, the extreme of universality is not just any abstract universal, nor again merely a single quality, but the universal determinateness, the specific principle of difference. So the middle term is human. What's the universal again?
Thinking animal.
Okay, thinking animal. Got it. Yeah. Okay. And man is the individual.
Right.
The only individual as far as we know, but I mean, we all know whales can think, but that's neither here nor there because
Well,
we don't have access to their brain pan directly.
right. I mean, they have managed to call a dolphin by their name before.
Right. That's very interesting. Okay, for the what do you have for the hypothetical syllogism?
Let me think which one. There's always two examples on this.
Okay.
So the particular to the individual, which is, if, because of the Big Bang, the universe expands.
Okay.
And then the individual to universal, the universe is expanding. And the particular to universal is therefore there was a Big Bang.
Got it.
Okay, this is a better one. When it rains, it gets wet. It gets wet.
Or in the
If it-
hypothetical, if it rains.
Yeah, when it rains, it gets wet, and then
Yeah.
it rains. Therefore, it is wet. So
Yeah.
if it rains, it gets wet. So since it rained, therefore it's wet. Yeah. So the PI is a big if. This is okay. So particular to individual is the hypothetical, and then the other two are the proof of it happening. Of the
Yeah.
first one, therefore the second one. Okay. Yeah, hypothesis. Okay, duh.
Oh. Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know,
It's interesting that we think of hypothetical as different from hypothesis. I mean, they're the same thing, but we treat them differently in the language. Like a hypothetical situation is sort of code for it could happen, but it probably isn't going to happen. In some contexts. In the scientific context, hypotheses are just you know, certain facts that are juxtaposed to let me start again. You take observations and you build a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is a possible or a contingent universal that may or may not be, and it's usually dependent on that set of variables being tested and then repeated again and again until you have what looks like a decent whatever you know if every time it rains you get wet, right? That could be a test. I don't know how far I'm stretching this or not. um
rains.
You know what I mean? Like maybe you could hypothesize that this time that it rains, you won't get wet. So you wait till it rains and it rains, right? You run your test. You check your umbrella, you check your hat. Is it wet? Okay.
We go from so I guess compare it back to the original. Rain. It's rain's the individual. Water would be the particular, and wetness would be the universal.
According to Zoolander, yeah.
But it's like, yeah, rain is a form of water which has the universality of wetness to it. So this would be the equivalent to the categorical to that, just to see the flow, not no pun intended, of the
Yeah.
how it jumps around, I guess is trying to say. So basically we were able to, it developed itself basically in the particular individual interaction, which I guess makes sense because it's how it worked before in the previous two. Okay. I'm thinking this too structurally, but because I just really want to see the thought shift fully.
Yeah.
Is what I'm trying to do.
I honestly, I'm gonna have to read this through with a fine-tooth comb later. Um, what does he say? The hypothetical on the bottom of 700. Sorry. Ugh. The hypothetical syllogism is the first, in the first instance, exhibits necessary relation as connection through the former negative unity, just as the categorical syllogism exhibits through the positive unity substantial content, objective universality. But necessity collapses into the necessary, the form activity of translating the conditioning into the conditioned actuality is in itself the unity in which the determinateness of the opposition that previously were liberated into an indifferent determinate existence are sublated, and the difference of A and B is an empty name. Thus, it is a unity reflected into itself, hence an identical content. And it is so not merely implicitly, but is also posited as such through this syllogism, in that the being of A is also not its own, but B's, and vice versa. And in general, the being of one is the being of the other. And in the conclusion, the immediate being or indifferent determinateness appear specifically as mediated. The externality of the determinatenesses has therefore sublated itself, and the unity into which they have withdrawn is posited. God, this shit is rough. I'm
Yeah, the
sorry.
equivalent section here says the mediation of the syllogism. It's A and B according to the overlapping version of the unity of the whole, an identical content in which their difference is sublated.
Yeah.
Mediation of the syllogism is an identity which differentiates itself and constitutes itself out of its differences as one single whole. And now we get disjunctive from that.
Is that the heresy reading off of?
Yeah.
Okay. You basically just said the same thing I just said, more or
Yeah.
less. Yeah.
Just like seeing if that helps at all.
Not really, no. Sorry.
I mean, I was trying to think because it's kind of reminding me of we've already gone through identity difference and then their combination. The opposite. Now we're kind of hitting the opposition that leads to a contradiction where they differentiate itself into a whole string, if I remember that right.
Oh, I'm not
We're
sure.
back to that part of essence in a way of how this evolves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because I mean, this is still essence. This is more the substantial, essential.
Right, because it kind of
is what it
it
is.
feels like equivalently the subjective is more closer to being in kind of it's kind of how it relates next. Objectivity almost feels like the essence of the notion. I
Yeah.
think this makes sense because it's the thing that's left over. There's no subjectivity left to it. It's the essentiality of the notion. Right. Well,
Okay, this is interesting. 701, halfway down, it says, as the hypothetical syllogism in general comes under the schema of the second figure of the formal syllogism, UIP, with individual as the mediating factor, so the disjunctive syllogism comes under the schema of the third figure, IUP, with universal as the middle term, that is pregnant with form. It has determined itself as totality, as developed objective universality. Consequently, the middle term is not only universality, but also particularity and individuality. As universality, it is first the substantial identity of the genius, but secondly, an identity that embraces within itself particularity, but a particularity coextensive with this identity of the genus. It is therefore the universal sphere that contains its total particularization, the genus disjoined into its species, A that is B and C and D. But particularization is differentiation, and as such, is just as much the either or of B, C, and D, the negative unity, the reciprocal exclusion of the terms.
So that's that's the two-sidedness of this. Yeah.
Right. So it's so yeah, so
Okay.
it's either or and right? It's
Yeah.
all of it. It's
It's
not
be-
only all the terms, but it's also the possibility that they could be excluded.
That's every time you go through this, you do have to keep track of the two tracks that keep moving forward. So why does that seem to be the same thing? Okay.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's fine. It's just
Okay.
like positive and then negative, and then their unity in the absolute, and then suddenly you got another positive. Yeah. It's because sometimes the negative comes out first. But anyways, I'm thinking a different project.
A is either B or C or D, but A is B. Therefore, A is neither C nor D.
It's like
Or again,
water.
A is either B or C or D, but A is neither C or D. Therefore, A is B. So it's a complex reasoning structure that lets you process more terms that are possible, but in the end, the syllogism, you know, uh, I don't know what I'd call it. I don't know.
I was like, just thinking the example from the poster makes sense. It's like, what water is it is not that this is not in the form of steam or water or liquid. Water is steam, liquid, or ice. Therefore, this must be ice.
Say say it all again, please.
Let me grab it. I think I'm going off the top of my head. This is neither ice nor water. That's the water is either ice, water, or steam. This is steam.
Okay.
Individual to particular. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that completes the loop, and everything collapses into a single or expands the same thing into one unity.
See what we need to do, and I'm sure someone has already done this somewhere, is make a handbook with like a good set of examples for all of these that make sense, and people are like, I do that every day,
Yes,
right?
I'm
I, ju-
I'm
I
a,
just don't I just don't think of them as discrete forms of reasoning, you know,
yeah.
because I mean, processing through things or notions as well as judgments, especially at this level. I mean, it's like higher functioning reasoning 101, like the building blocks. And being able to not only do all of them but see how they're all sort of connected logically is like where Hegel's aiming here. Hmm. Ah, this is interesting. Bottom of 702. So, in this way, then, the formalism of the syllogistic process in general, and with it the subjectivity of the syllogism and of the notion in general, has sublated itself. This formal or subjective side consisted in the fact that the mediating factor of the extremes is the notion as an abstract determination, and this latter is distinct from the extremes whose unity it is. In the consummation of the syllogism, on the other hand, where objective universality is no less posited as totality of the form determinations, the distinction of mediating and mediated has disappeared. That which is mediated is itself an essential moment of what mediates it, and each moment appears as the totality of what is mediated.
Bring that down after the main.
That's that's pretty deep there. Or not, I don't know.
Well, I mean,
Never mind. It was stupid.
it's a continuation of the fact
Just
that
kidding.
each three sides of the syllogism develops itself, which
Yeah.
supplement the judgment, but
Yeah.
they all inter-support each other throughout the entire process.
Yeah, that lights.
And that's kind of why I've been thinking. It's kind of like the individual itself always has moments of the particular and universal in it. The particular has moments of the, yeah, etc. So they kind of, that's how I feel like they evolve into each different figure is just that aspect coming out.
And it's interesting to me at the bottom of 701, he points out something really key. He says, further, this exclusion is not merely a reciprocal exclusion or the determination merely a relative one, but it is just as essentially a self-related determination. The particular is individuality to the exclusion of the others. So each of these terms going into the syllogistic uh, process
Yeah,
at the at this stage as notions or judgments or syllogisms themselves, right? You get up to the higher math stuff, right? They're all self-related. We've left the book of being and the book of essence. From notion on, everything is self-related. Okay? I think that's important to note because sometimes in reasoning we can try to reason through things that depend on something else, and it probably comes across as an error. Like if you put in terms and one of the terms wasn't really what it was in and of itself, but rather only in relation to something else that's not referenced, right? And then you have a bad piece of reasoning, right? Because one of the terms is faulty, I guess you could say. Does that make sense? I don't know. I can't think of any other way that one would you create a non self-related determination than something that was stood in for something else that it had nothing to do with, like Trump and freedom, right? I don't know.
So sorry, I just went to took a look. I'm like, okay, because I
Did
know there's
did you find something good?
abstract algebra where it's like they throw everything to symbols.
Yeah.
Abstract algebra syllogism. Oh yeah, that exists. Ugh.
Oh, I'm sure it does. The syllogism goes all the way back to Aristotle and the idea that they would try to convert it into a quantity scheme through algebra. I mean, I would be
And
surprised if they hadn't.
that's what the Wikipedia page for syllogism gets into. Oh right.
Right. Ugh.
But yeah, I'm like looking at stuff. I'm like, that's a
Yeah.
bit much because it's treating it like a matrix. Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it probably will. And actually, if you wanted to write it down on one sheet of paper, that's kind of the way you would have to do it. With Hegel,
Hmm.
he wrote it all out longhand, and it's several pages long. If you wanted to get the one page treatment, you would have to use symbols only. But then again, you would have to know what each symbol meant in order to interact with it properly.
Carol diagram.
I call that gatekeeping, but that's probably cynical. What do you think?
That's always on a spectrum.
Well,
On a monad.
well, I'm in good company then, because so am I.
Yeah.
Uh, man, I
Yeah,
feel
well,
terrible. What's up, Jim?
say people have been using, had the idea of using symbols for a long time, but but it didn't really become. It wasn't really developed in a rigorous manner. I mean, Leibniz tried to do it, but never quite got. It never quite succeeded. In
Yeah.
the 19th century, George Boole, developed his Boolean algebra, and
Yes, that's right.
that was, he applied it to, he had classes and propositions. And later on, Frege.
Boolean was highly used in early programming too.
Yeah, and that's used in hardware design, the design of the switching circuits.
Yeah, that is so cool.
I mean, that was the subject of Claude Shannon's master's thesis at MIT in the 30s. He wrote it because he was doing a thesis in electrical engineering, but as an undergrad he had taken a course in mathematical logic, so he decided to use that for simplifying switching circuits, like for telephone systems.
Hmm.
That was their concern at the time, was telephone circuitry. How do you simplify that? And Claude Shannon showed you could use that to Boolean algebra to do that.
Yeah.
Then a few years later, people, well, you could do computations with the circuits. First computer circuits were built with electromechanical relays, and they said, well, vacuum tubes would be much better with
Mhm.
transistors and so forth. That's just on the hardware side. It's also on the software side too.
To this day, I look at a circuit board and I really wish I could see it like an electrical engineer. And it just looks like a green, you know, card with a bunch of wiring embedded in it. Never quite got the hang of trying to do that engineering stuff. I think if I had it to do all over, like I woke up tomorrow and I was 16, I would sign up for electrical engineering because I mean you could get lost in that architecture. And I'd probably have a kick-ass job today. Uh, you know, doing quantum computing or whatever the hell that is.
That may or may not be at a plateau right now.
Well, whenever I think of quantum computing, I think of the MCU with the guy who like shrank,
Oh.
to like quantum sizes, you know, and then met some bugs or whatever, and then came back in time or whatever. It's probably not the same thing.
Well, the idea of quantum computing goes back, I think, to Richard Feynman in the 60s, but
Yeah,
back in the 60s, they didn't really have the technology to implement that.
him and his bongos.
Yeah.
He'd get high in the desert and play his drums. Okay. All right. I'm going to switch gears here because of course we're not going to completely um get through this. Every aspect of the syllogism. That to me is an ongoing issue. Let's move on to objectivity with the time that we have. Uh so I read through this um and it's very interesting actually. Because one of the things that really stands out to me is um, how much I think we've sort of taken for granted immediacy. But in the first two pages, he talks about immediacy an awful lot.
Cool.
And also remember that in talking about objectivity, we're sort of getting into the issue in the EL where you have one thing that's hyphenated object, which is the object of consciousness. Then you have objectivity, and that's this right here is the objectivity. That's the opposite, or not the opposite, but the counterpart, I should say, of subjectivity. Um, uh, I really wish I had highlighted this because so he talks about the notion of God to his existence and how Well, shit, I should just start reading it off, and it'll make more sense. In book one of the objective logic, abstract being was exhibited as passing over into determinate being, but equally as withdrawing into essence. In book two, essence reveals itself as determining itself into ground, thereby entering into existence and realizing itself as substance. But again, withdrawing into the notion. Of the notion now, we have shown to begin with that it determines itself into objectivity. It is self-evident that this, and I love when he says this is self-evident because he reminds me a little bit of Chomsky. Chomsky always says it's obvious that blah, blah, blah. It's not always obvious, okay, to your readers what something is in international law or any of this other stuff. But for some reason, he liked to say that. I don't know. It is self-evident that this latter transition is identical in character with what formerly appeared in metaphysics as the inference from the notion, namely the notion of God, to his existence, or as the so-called ontological proof of the existence of God. Okay, so this is interesting. All right, so we've gone from the entire run of the objective and gotten to the point of objectivity. Everything that is content for objectivity goes from book one all the way up until this point. Okay. And before then, objectivity can't even really be said to be a thing, right? Not it's kind of like trying to say sheer being is the absolute, like the elitics, right? Back then they said that everything, not that it is, is, or that it has being, it's all there is, right? It's the reverse for Hegel. Hegel says that you cannot really have a category until all its moments add up to it, and this is one of those. This is one of those times when he summarizes very nicely. You go from abstract being passing over into determinate being, but equally as withdrawing into essence. Book two, essence reveals itself as determining itself into ground, right? Thereby entering into existence and realizing itself as substance. So now, and that has withdrawn into the notion. And now the notion has determined itself as objectivity. Okay. It is equally well known that Descartes' sublimest thought that God is that whose notion includes within itself its being, after being degraded into the defective form of the formal syllogism, that is, into the form of the said proof, finally succumbed to the critique of reason and to the thought that existence cannot be extracted from the notion. Interesting. So he's starting to use all of these categories and reasoning it through, right, to define objectivity is what I'm hearing from him. In volume one, where being has already has vanished into its immediate opposite, non-being, and becoming has shown itself as the truth of both, attention was drawn to the confusion that arises when, in the case of a particular determinate being, what is fixed on is not the being of that determinate being, but its determinate content. Then, comparing this determinate content, for example, $100 with another determinate content, for example, with the context of my perception or the state of my finances. So he's starting to dig down into the difference between different kinds of determinate content. And it is found that it makes a difference whether the former content is added to the latter or not. And it is imagined that what has been discussed is the difference between being and non-being, or even the difference between being and the notion. Okay. Did you guys read through this? The objectivity? Okay. I mean, I'm not going to read. Maybe I really should read it through. It's very interesting, but it's also kind of
Well,
kind of a long thing.
one thing I thought was interesting, kind of reinterpret, is the way Harris called out this section in this one paragraph.
Yeah,
What has been summarized in the guise of religion, it's the same process as that of the overcoming in science and philosophy of the externality and alienality of external nature. So
yeah,
they already got me like, oh, under the guise of religion, which, yeah,
yes,
by which we find it only ourselves, or conversely, the process by which we lead the object back to the subjectivity that it's our own inner consciousness and knowledge.
yes. That wow, that's tremendous. Yeah, yeah,
Because the part he finds that was it's he talked about the two different types of objects, which he says in the an encyclopedia logic that later basically we'll find that the two are the same.
yeah.
The object and hyphenate object are the same, but that will come up later. But what was it specifically? I mean, obviously, besides the point, he's comparing many different earlier instances of the immediate to each other, including objectivity.
Mm.
I thought was interesting to see how further developed it gets. I'm just trying to think outside of like, yeah, besides the fact of sheer being in the beginning, you get all the way to the point of like, yeah, there's this thing that we're able to understand of the real world that makes sense.
Yeah.
Not just an existence, but it's actual and actually, and I think that's a point where it's still kind of getting the notion down, but
Oh, go ahead.
no, it's kind of agrees with what's in her head. It's beginning to come to terms to that, actually.
Yeah. I really like this in 706. He says, on the other hand, however, it is essential to bear in mind the remark made above that the subject only obtains determinateness and content in its predicate. Until then, no matter what it may be for feeling, intuition, and pictorial thinking, like God, God is everything, but until God hits the predicate, you know, doesn't really have a determined content at all, right? For rational cognition, it is only a name, like God. He says this early in the EL somewhere, that or maybe in like the preface or the introduction, I forget. But he makes the point that in religion, you can't just say God is God, or I is I. Like you haven't really defined it, right? It isn't a proper predicate, and therefore, you know, it it can't be objective. Objective, I guess you could say. Name. But in the predicate with its determinateness, there begins at the same time realization in general, is what he says. The predicates, however, must be grasped as themselves still included within the notion, hence as something subjective, which so far has not emerged into existence. To this extent, we must admit, on the one hand, that the realization of the notion in the judgment is still not complete. So we haven't even gotten to subjectivity, right? In general. The mere determination of an object by predicates, when that determination is not at the same time the realization and objectifying of the notion, also remains something so subjective that is not even the genuine cognition and determination of the notion of the object. Subjective in the sense of abstract reflection and uncomprehended pictorial thinking. God is the living God, and still more as absolute spirit. This is one of those weasel sentences he gets at. So he says God as the living God, and still more as absolute spirit. Absolute spirit is the height, the ultimate category in this book, which is the end of which is at the end of the what would you call it? The first syllogism. Okay? He's stitching together all of these categories logically. All right. So when he's talking about God, what he really means is absolute spirit. That's what he means. He tells you right here, right? But he doesn't, he doesn't exactly say it. He has to kind of weasel into it. God, as the living God, and still more as absolute spirit, is known only in his activity. Man was early instructed to recognize God in his works. I love this. Only from these can proceed the determinations, which are called his properties, and in which too his being is contained. He's basically telling you that God is nature, same as Spinoza, but he can't come out and say Spinoza was right. Here's what Spinoza said. I'm leaning on his authority. No, he's not doing any of that. He is stitching the categories he's already put out there together logically, so that there are no Spinoza-sized fingerprints on them. I believe Harrison called this borrowed light.
Question on. Hegel had earlier referred to Kant's critique of the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Kant had argued that the argument fails because existence is not a predicate.
Yeah, you can't. You can't. What did he say? You can't deduce existence from the notion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Hegel is trying to establish the existence of the absolute spirit. So
Yeah, that you can indeed deduce existence from the notion.
yeah.
But the notion is not the same thing as our common sense version. The notion is the full self what's the word? I'm sorry. I have to go back. It's the full self-related being, right? That populates everything. Everything that can be categorized into a notion correctly has its own being. And the notion reflects that because the notion is correctly a notion, right? Yeah. It's funny because when I read this section, he talks about how man was early instructed to recognize God in his works. Only from these can proceed the determinations. And in my head, I'm going, then came Protestantism, and notice how the proof that God exists moves from determinations based on his works to faith that he exists. It's a lower standard. You're told to do as we say rather than look around you and interact with God's world. You're basically moved from you're moved from a higher category into that of someone who's passive, a slave. You're supposed to do what we say and trust us is the standard. And if you think of how Marx delineated capitalism and its alienation, I mean, it's pretty easy to see how that played out materially. And now I'm going to get hate mail from all the Lutherans. Actually, I wonder if this is something Hegel or thought about himself, because he always talks about how Lutheranism was the revolution in religious thought, and that its articulation more closely resembled philosophical truth even though it didn't. It was able to get across things in the guise of religion that previous religion hadn't been able to do. I guess you could say. I don't know. Does that track? Mm. Yeah. Thus, the philosophical cognition of his activity, that is, of himself, grasps the notion of God in his being and his being in his notion. Being merely as such, or even determinate being, is such a meager and restricted determination that the difficulty of finding it in the notion may well be the result of not having considered what being or determinate being itself is. Being is the wholly abstract immediate relation to self, is nothing else than the abstract moment of the notion, which moment is abstract universality. So notice how in the notion it's turned into an attribute of itself, whereas earlier we just called it sheer being, right? And even then it still had the character of exactly what we call it now. I don't know. This universality, yeah, this is at the bottom of 706, sorry. This universality also affects what one demands of being, namely to be outside the notion. For though this universality is a moment of the notion, is equally the difference or abstract judgment of the notion to which it opposes itself to itself. The notion, even as formal, already immediately contains being in a truer and richer form, in that, as self related negativity, it is individuality. Yeah. This this section's great.
Thanks. I didn't really get too much into monadism or
What?
monadology. I didn't get too
Oh,
much into. I still haven't gotten monadology by Leibniz, which he compares more so in the EL as an example of an object that still shows a contradiction between, like saying right there, the self-relating individuality, but still dependent among everything else. It's like a further explication of the identity of identity and difference that occurs there, except Leibniz's you know relationship is based purely on externality of the other objects against each other. So the idea of the universe is in each monad because it's not the other objects. But from a Hegelian
yeah,
perspective, it's more of an internal distinction because it is a self-determining negativity.
right.
Because but in the monad of monad, I forgot he did that.
Mm.
I do like, however, the $100 in money there came back at least.
Yeah.
I get myself sit down properly this week and actually just sit with this stuff.
Look on the bottom of page 707, says, yet objectivity is just that much richer and higher than the being or existence of the ontological proof, as the pure notion is richer and higher than the metaphysical void of the sum total of all reality.
Physical void. Is that the night of black cat with black cows kind of metaphysical void, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's probably what he means. Um, it's interesting here. He talks about logical formalism.
Yeah.
And he also talks about restoring the fundamental thoughts of these proofs to their worth and dignity. In other words, they're incomplete and they're pointing at the wrong object, I think. And then on 708, he goes into what I talked about earlier. He says, as previously remarked, we have already met with several forms of immediacy, though in different determinations. In the sphere of being, immediacy is being itself and determinate being. In the sphere of essence, it is existence, and then actuality and substantiality. In the sphere of the notion, besides immediacy as abstract universality, there is now objectivity. When the exactitude of philosophical distinctions of the notion is not involved, these expressions may be used as synonymous, but the determinations mentioned have issued from the necessity of the notion. Being is in general the first immediacy, and determinate being is the same plus the first determinateness. Existence, along with things, is the immediacy that issues from the ground, from the sublating mediation of the simple reflection of essence, but actuality and substantiality is the immediacy that has issued from the sublated difference of the still unessential existence as appearance and its essentiality. And finally, objectivity is the immediacy to which the notion determines itself by the sublation of its abstraction and mediation. Philosophy has the right to select from the language of common life, which is made for the world of pictorial thinking, such expressions as seem appropriate to the determinations of the notion. There cannot be any question of demonstrating for a word selected from the language of common life that in common life too one associates with it the same notion for which philosophy employs it. For common life has no notions, but only pictorial thoughts and general ideas, and to recognize the notion in what is else a mere general idea is philosophy itself. It must suffice, therefore, if pictorial thinking, in the use of its expressions that are employed for philosophical determinations, has before it some vague idea of their distinctive meaning, just as it may be the case that in these expressions one recognizes nuances of pictorial thought that are more closely related to the corresponding notions. That's interesting. A little bit of a meditation on using regular words to talk about philosophy, but the words don't just reflect their sort of vague common usage, but are submerged in the organization and logic that philosophy gives them. So they're not just, it's not just the notion. Is the notion isn't just sort of a definition in and of itself of what it is. It's also the structure that the logic of what it is that Hegel has unfolded so far. Uh, you know, that's why all of these categories look so alien to us, especially when they're seem so familiar, but we're not familiar with the logical shapes as well that define what we. I sorry, I kind of lost it. I have it in my head. It makes sense. But to say it out loud, to try to paraphrase Hegel is very, very hard. Um,
Bill?
All right, I'll be right back.
This thing that the people are going. Uh, right, I just gonna sit down with subject object yet again. Ooh. Okay.
All right, sorry about that. Okay. So, it's 9/11. Sorry. Um, uh,
Still, those steel beams ain't gonna melt themselves.
I know, right? We need dank memes for
God.
that.
Nope. I'm just thinking, what's the modern 9/11 conspiracy theory? Like, what's the new thing? And it's like,
Yeah.
it's election stealing crap. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Okay. What I would suggest is that we go through chapters 1 and 2, mechanism and chemism, because chemism is relatively short and it's sort of dependent on aspects of mechanism anyway, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's only like 20 odd pages. So it's not actually that long. Does that sound good to both of you?
Yeah.
And it gets us that much closer to um the end, I guess you could say. Because then
Also,
because then the next chapter is teleology, and that's a whole
oh,
thing.
that's what I was gonna say. This whole chapter did remind me of what the objective thing he was talking. He's going how I even back in when I was younger, all my parents, the whole evangelical kind of, I guess the pejorative would be this guy daddy concept and the way they love to do things. I
Yeah.
always thought, why would God be human? Why would just be our consciousness would be God? And that's what Hegel essentially says there. That'd be the closer approximation
Oh
than the
wow,
human God.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so say that again. So,
So,
Daddy in the sky.
the pictorial version, that's the kind of the human, that's the finite God because you're giving him human characteristics. But I'm trying to think, I have to go back and find where he kind of talks about it that way, but it's like it's more if we were creating the image of God, it would be in our how we think, how our consciousness.
Yeah.
That is the thing that reflects God in a finite sense more than our bodies,
Yeah.
which relates back to exactly what we're going through.
Yeah, it's um one
Yeah.
one of the things I find very interesting about Hegel is that early on, he came out with the critique of positive religion. And I think reading his system in that light makes it so much easier to parse statements about God from beginning to end, because whenever he talks about God, he's not talking about the religious dogmatic or the state dogmatic
Right.
forms that are used in the church, or and so the question is, well, what God are you talking about, right? And slowly but surely, you figure out, okay, he's talking about absolute spirit, which is the culmination of the system. So basically, nature is culminated with us, but it also contains nature, and it also contains logic in the thought form, but also in the form of being. And the form of being predates, I should say, it fills nature and spirit and logic with what it is, right? Literally what it is, right?
Mhm.
Like the all of the laws of existence that he I guess you could say poses, appearance, existence, actuality, contingency, all of those things, right? He defines what it is to talk about existence in the first place, as well as all the other stuff, right? And the fact that that being suffuses everything else. I think it's the hardest lesson to learn from Hegel's work, is that when he's talking about um, the fact that the totality of being, which is absolute idea, suffuses nature and is externalizes is in it, right? Nature, from its first category to its last, including us, is populated by the totality of being, you know, in an existential sense. Like, here are the rules of how this universe works. That's pretty deep. All right. I'm going to leave it there.
I was just reminded of young Frederick Engels' religious development. He's during his business training, he's lived with one of his uncles who was a minister. The minister had a large theological library, and Engels decided he was going to read everything in that library. So he started off the more conservative theological works, which fitted in with his religious upbringing.
Yeah.
And then he goes to the more liberal writings, like from Schleiermacher, who was, trying to restate Protestant theology in terms of Kant and Spinoza. So Engels reads those. He adopts those ideas. Eventually, he finds his way to Feuerbach, who had taken Hegel and drew atheistic conclusions. So that's when Engels becomes an atheist.
Yeah. Man. It's outstanding.
So he sort of recapitulates most of it, what we had just discussed here in Hegel. Engels recapitulated on his own by reading his uncle's theological library.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think, God, I really wish both Marx and Engels had had a couple more lifetimes to like just parse through this shit and just be like, okay, all right. Um, like not only do I understand it and I can sort of apply it to my work, but you know, I can get it to where it's teachable, or at least more teachable than some cryptic documents and an awful lot of time on your hands. You know, because by the time you understand everything, you're an old man and you're like, well, uh, that was fun. Not sure what else I can do with that, man. All right, comrades. I wish you a great week. I'll see you on Monday next, and we'll talk about mechanism and chemism. Have a good night.
Right.